first question on what encouraged me, I grew up in New Jersey. I'm going to date myself here in the 60s, been through several riots in different cities and, guilty of nothing more than walking while black as a teenager and being stopped by the police. And one time I had a conversation with my dad about those kinds of interactions. And he said, you can't change the castle from outside the moat. And
That's true.
so I said, all right. And so lo and behold, I became a police officer in Santa Monica, my first stop, because I wanted to be part of the change that I was looking for. And I encourage young progressives, if we had progressives who became police officers, we could probably reduce the risk of incidents of young black and brown men getting killed by the police. Because I will say this without any data supporting me, and I have to say this, I have a saying in my center that goes, without data, you're just somebody with an opinion. So this is just an opinion. You find two things. Number one, black and brown officers are not involved in those kinds of incidents as often as their colleagues. And female officers are not involved in those incidents as much as their colleagues. So there's a reason for that. I don't have the study to prove it. And hopefully one day my center will get funded so we can do that study. But I say that. The second piece I'm going to say is the government that everybody doesn't like is us. We are the government.
Right.
And people need to understand that they get what they vote for or not. And so I often encourage people in that respect to support the government, become part of that government change you want to be. I'm encouraged when I see young people running for office. There's, there may be a minimum age, but if there is, once you pass that, run, change things. And I think that, the reason we flipped states in the last election is because young people understood two things. We can run for office and we can vote. And I think that's very important. And so when I say public service, it's not just about public office, though. It's also about public entities. I mean, with all due respect, when you are in public service, many people are going to be in positions where those jobs, even if I'm looking at the storm right now that we're having in the Southeast, those public servants are working. Right. They're going to be working when good times, bad times, job security, benefits, making a difference to the community, giving back. There's just too many opportunities that in public government and public service that we pass up. And I wish we would take more advantage of that.
Awesome. What are you reading right now?
Oh, boy. I'm going to disappoint you because I'm reading things like
essays.
No. It's not that. I'm reading things like the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism.
That's interesting.
I'm reading things that are pretty contemporary and coming out like within the last 6 months as it relates to the extremist violence space, the national security space, and the police reform space.
Wow.
So I'm reading things like that.
In police reform, what are you reading? That's interesting.
Mostly studies. There are a study I just read recently on Yale University where officers who get fired and get rehired wind up getting in not just trouble again, but worse trouble.
Wow.
Reading some studies about officers officer screening, because the Lewis Registry behind me, in the interest of full disclosure, is an initiative out of our center, the Safe Communities Institute at the Saul Price School of Public Policy. And it's named after John Lewis. The acronym stands for the Law Enforcement Work Inquiry System. And so we are the first national unified database to document officers who've been fired for misconduct in the country. And that's going to be free and available to anybody in the country in October, that they can search names, they can search agencies, they can search offenses, and most importantly, find out if people have been fired and they're still working. So I'm reading things as it relates to police reform. And again, we want to be part of that change, right? Mm-hmm. Well, I come from a discipline in law enforcement where everybody thinks it's about policy. The challenge in law enforcement is not a policy issue. I mean, we jokingly say police departments eat policy for breakfast. The challenges in law enforcement are about a culture, and you can't change the culture unless you change the people. So my contribution to this is we're going to start with officers who get fired. And when they get fired, they should stay fired. And they should not be working again, putting other people in harm's way. And so I'm reading a lot of work that's being done now in that space of officer misconduct, officer terminations, and things like that.
Awesome. I think we're all aware of violence against African Americans during the pandemic right now. But can you speak to some of the issues the Jewish community are facing? I just spoke to Rabbi Black. He's chaplain in the Colorado State Legislature. I spoke with him a little bit about it. So some of the issues the Jewish community and the Asian community are facing in terms of violence.
Barry, I'm glad you're asking this question. We started a link on our site at the Safe Communities Institute called #VirusOfHate.
Huh.
You know, with the last administration essentially vilifying Asian Americans and Jews for being the cause or the source of COVID-19, extremely exacerbated communities that were already being targeted by right-wing extremists and other extremists.
Huh.
We saw an incredible uptick in the Asian American Pacific Islander community. What's really interesting about that is they were happening in really defined spaces like pharmacies, big box retail stores when people go shopping.
Right.
Incidents where people were they were spraying Asian Americans with disinfectant and assaulting them on public transit. I have a slide that I do in a presentation where in a space of 12 hours between New York and LA, an Asian person was getting accosted on the metro system in both cities at the same time.
Wow.
So we see that. We see Asians being blamed for this. I'm sorry, Jews being blamed for this as part of this Jewish elite that somehow founded this or started this disease. It all falls into the fact that they believe the Jewish government's running the United States. I mean, the Jewish people running the United States government. And then it devolves into QAnon conspiracy theories and things like that. So what we had during this time, Barry, of COVID and stay-at-home orders was, no pun intended, the stay-at-home COVID era became an incubator for all kinds of extremist beliefs to coalesce under this banner of anti-government. And some of the easiest targets during that time were houses of worship. So as I've been giving talks before and during COVID, I've given more talks to congregations in AME churches, synagogues, than any place else in the last several years. And what's really troubling is that many of these faith-based communities don't realize that they're being targeted. They don't realize the risks that they're taking going to their church, going to their synagogue. So we've been trying to make them better educated and more aware of that threat, and also making them aware of some resources that they can tap into for free to reduce the risk of those things happening.